Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Higher Ed Live. I'm Marie Elliott, joining from Indiana, and this week I will be serving as your host. Higher Ed Live has offered direct access to the best and brightest minds in higher education and allowed audience members to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in our industry. All episodes are free and can be accessed at higheredlive.com. Or you can take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcasts wherever you listen. Higher Ed Live is produced by Platform Q Education, the leading developer of online engagement software and strategies. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter below and connect with us on social media using the hashtag Higher Ed Live. For our podcast listeners, all of this information will be available in the episode notes. This week, we are discussing graduate recruitment trends and the future, and we are lucky to have on Marcus Hanscom. To start us off, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, hi, Marie. Thanks for having me. Great to connect with Platform Q and Higher Ed Live. I've known Higher Ed Live over a number of years and certainly heard about it in my old undergraduate years, but I'm now the Director of Graduate Admission at Roger Williams University. We're in Bristol, Rhode Island. Nice waterfront campus. We don't mind it here. I've been here about 6 years and previously with the University of New Haven in Connecticut. I worked there for about 9 years, including about 7 of which were exclusively grad. I did 1 year of kind of grad and undergrad, and I lived in the dark side of undergrad fully for a year before that. So I've kind of bounced around a little bit in admissions and did some corporate recruitment, but the bulk of my career has been in graduate enrollment management. And certainly we can get into kind of the different hoops of that because it's certainly not just an admission silo. And fortunately, have a lot of opportunity to work with NAGAP, the Association for Graduate Enrollment Management. So and those of your audience that are interested in graduate enrollment, I hope you'll connect with NAGAP. I served on the board there a few times and also run our podcast, the NAGAP Report. So I hope you'll listen to us there.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm really excited to tap into your resource for understanding the nuanced differences between graduate and undergraduate recruitment, whether that's the understanding of the audience in specific or building out goals for how to reach those audiences. We'd love to get some of your feedback on how we can really make sure we are serving students well.
Yeah, I mean, with graduate, and I'm sure you've got some folks that are previously undergrad that maybe are now in the grad world or got some responsibility added to their plates lately, especially those of you that are a smaller campus like mine, where they're starting to think that graduate is certainly going to be more important to the longer term revenue streams of the institutions, certainly mission-centric pieces, but really just being responsive to the marketplace and thinking about the job demands in corporate America of whether folks need a master's or a doctorate to pursue the work that they're doing, but also kind of there's been a lot of discussion about the value of graduate education and so on. And there's a lot of areas that need licensure, which I always find unfortunate because there are areas like mental health counseling, for example, that require a license. They require 60 graduate credits in a master's program. So these people that don't make a whole lot of money that do really critical societal work have to pay for these really expensive degrees to get there. So it's kind of sad how that's set up, but it's just the reality of the world. And with graduate education becoming more important, you look at the undergraduate cliff that we've been talking about for over a decade. We knew that the population shifts and the ages of students graduating and how high school graduates were kind of plateauing in many areas of the country, particularly here in the Northeast, but around the country. And in many areas are going to be declining over the next 5 to 10 years. There's some reality checks that a lot of our schools have to do and thinking about how we can sustain the institution and the growth that we want. And nonprofit or otherwise, we all need the revenue to support the valuable missions that we're doing. So we have to think differently. So graduate is becoming more important. Continuing ed is becoming more important. And what's critical for folks to know about the graduate versus the undergrad world is it's not as simple as just saying, okay, we did this for undergrad, but let's just apply it to grad. It's not that simple. Right. We can't just do the same marketing, doing the same recruitment tactics. One size fits all does not work for grad. Undergrad is very much, not to oversimplify it, but undergrad largely is catering to a high school graduate, and you're talking to folks in a 16 to 18 age group that largely are rite of passage, so to speak, and some folks need a degree because that's just what they need to do for their work. And there's still a lot of value on that. I was just reading the other day, and there's a lot of question around, do I need a graduate education? Are employers going to want this? What about, there's been a lot of talk the last few years about mini masters and these little certifications and other things as alternative credentials. And sure, there's value in that, but employers, the article I just read was talking about how our employers are hiring MBAs at the same rate as they were prior to COVID, and they anticipate that for at least the next 5 years. So if you think about at least the business market, they're still looking at MBAs as a value that they need to have. And there's still been that question, well, do I need to get an MBA? I can just go get my work experience. Well, in a crowded marketplace, maybe the MBA is the differentiator that you need. And especially after COVID, I think a lot of industries, a lot of companies are thinking, how can we hire employees that are going to be strategic and thinking outside the box and being proactive and not reactive to something like the pandemic. And I hope that we've all learned that these things can and will continue to happen, and we need people that are responding to that. And I think that's a differentiator with the master's level education. You're no longer being just fed information that you spit back on a test. You're instead thinking critically about core issues to your area, and then thinking about how you can apply that knowledge out to your work. And so I think there's a much different outcome, and there's a different intent of getting a master's or a doctorate for that matter to impact your work. So kind of a long-winded answer, but
yeah, no, and the pathway to graduate education is very different. You mentioned with undergrad, it is a rite of passage. There are a small population that takes the gap year, and there's another population that goes and does real world life first before they make their way back. But for the majority of undergrad population, they know starting junior year, they need to start looking at schools. They know sometime senior year, they probably need to apply. Like there's that cookie cutter approach. Whereas with graduate recruitment, you might be talking to a student for 5, 6, 7 years before they're ready to pull the trigger, or they saw the writing on the wall at work and they would like to enroll next week, if that's something your institution can do. So having that flexibility and that understanding in the graduate marketing space is going to truly help set institutions apart, especially with the needs of graduate students leaning so heavily towards a lot of online programs. You're competing in a very saturated space, and most institutions can't go and be the cheapest option, right? So how do you get your message across in a way that speaks to those students and really provides them the information they need ahead of time? Building that out and knowing that you're getting them on-demand content, easily accessible when they need it, whether that's on a lunch break at work or 2 a.m. after they put kids to bed, or those schedules are not nearly as predictable as some of those things that they can get away with undergraduate recruitment. There's a big shift that needs to happen if an institution is going to start putting a priority on graduate students.
Yeah, and one thing that's critical about, that really kind of gets at what you're talking about is there are those programs where students, if they want to be a doctor, they know they have to go to med school, right? Or if they want to be a licensed clinical therapist, they have to get, mental health counseling or, similar degree. But for a lot of graduate programs, they're discretionary. And so if you're thinking about discretionary spending as a consumer, right? We're buying things that we want, and sometimes we need, and sometimes a combination of the two. But one thing that marketers in our space, especially at the graduate level, need to be thinking about is developing personas. We've talked about this a lot of late. Really thinking about who those core students are in the programs that you offer, and ultimately the students that are attracted to a program like that you offer. And I always tell people, you have to start inward first. You have to be introspective about who's sitting in my classroom now, what kind of program are we delivering, what delivery model. Sometimes it's as simple as like, what's our curriculum, what's our research, what's our internships, what are the things that we do? So getting a good sense of what it is that's on home base now, and then say, okay, how do we get this to the right people in the marketplace? So when you're talking about marketing, obviously it's very targeted with a grad student audience, but if you have personas, you could say, okay, well then there's maybe 2 or 3 personas for a given program that are target folks that we want to get into our program. So maybe if it's a part-time program in the evenings in a city, so like we have programs in Providence, for example, we know that on average, the average age is 32 to 34. it skews a little bit more female than male. So we might say, okay, Samantha is a working professional. She has a young child. She's looking for flexibility, an evening program or online, and she's looking for public administration, something like that. So we can then take those needs that she has as a persona and kind of replicate that across how we do our marketing strategy for that program and get to other Samanthas in the market. And ultimately, that's where we have to think about grad a little differently, because it's not a matter of like, oh, we have a part-time program, let's just spray it on all the radio stations, let's put it out on Google, see what happens.
Right.
It has to be a very tailored approach. So in some ways, it's very labor intensive, at least to get going, if you do it right, because you have to look at those programs and make very specific targeting decisions. And ultimately, if you do it right, you're going to be introspective, figure out who you are, right? Then you figure out where are these people going to be, and maybe the aspirant audience also. And sometimes that's a whole other persona in and of itself. And then you can get that marketing out there, get results, and hopefully assess what worked, and then kind of revisit that whole process. And that's what I always encourage folks in marketing, particularly for grad programs, to do, is this kind of cyclical nature of our work. That obviously we've got the admissions cycle, that's not what I'm talking about, but more about, from a marketing lens, do the internal self-awareness work, do informed marketing decisions for your demographics, measure those results, and then ultimately use that to go back to that first stage again and repeat. So if you're doing it correctly, that should hopefully inform you to do a strategic and hopefully data-informed decision-making process for your marketing for grad students. And I think that's the most effective and one of the deepest, differences with undergrad and grad, because undergrad, they're at high schools. You can go do high school visits, and you're going to run into students that want different majors and things, but you're selling an experience, you're selling our location. Sometimes students that are 17 years old want to know about the parties at your school and those types of things. And there's nothing wrong with that. The undergraduate college experience is a holistic personal growth as well as academic growth experience for students.
Yeah. I picked my undergrad because of being able to play soccer. Like that's not the most strategic option, but kids are kids.
Yeah. So there are differences there. And admittedly, when I was at New Haven, they asked me to go over to the grad office. And one of the reasons they had thought about that was, how can we get somebody internal who is familiar with the campus and things? We don't have to upskill and get this person ready, and can put them there and hopefully hit the ground running, because that was just the nature of the cycle. And my first question was, we have a graduate school here? So we have tendency, and I know it because I lived it in undergrad, to think that the only world is undergrad. And in some cases, my grad world is very grad centric now. And I mean, I think, we have 4+1s and other things, so I'm more integrated than I think some folks are. But we have a tendency to get in our bubble and then forget that other world exists. But when you're selling a grad program, once I got over to grad, long story longer here, I was kind of thinking, I didn't want to work with grad students at all. I was holding on to the undergrad stuff, like, pull it out of my dead cold hands, and I did undergrad. So that middle year, I did undergrad and grad because I was afraid to let the undergrad go. But when I've gotten over to grad, I love grad now. So, and it's turned into a life passion and something I really care about. And I'm fortunate to have gotten there. But had I stayed in undergrad, I might not have ever found that. And with undergrad, you're working with parents. We're working with plenty of parents on the grad side too, but for different reasons. But largely the grad students are very focused on, I want to do a thing, and will your program get me there? And I love working on the grad side in that I can have a fit conversation first and foremost, and not be concerned about saying, well, don't go to XYZ school up the street, we're better than them, because the undergrad can be far more competitive, and you're talking about experience as much as you are the program, whereas ours is, do we have what will get you there, or we don't? And if we don't, I say, go look at this school, I'll go look at that school, and I can call this person at that school and help you, or let me help you with your personal statement, but we don't have your program here, so let's go somewhere else. And so it's a lot more about advising what's best for the student, as opposed to just filling our coffers here. And ultimately, as marketers, we know that if we do that job well, those same students will then tell their friends, families, coworkers, students, and say, hey, look, Marcus at Roger Williams cared about me enough to say they're not going to help me, but he goes somewhere else. So maybe talk to him and he can tell you if he can help you find a program there that will work, or he'll get you to the best place. And ultimately, all of that works in our favor, because our numbers still turn out exactly where we want them to be, without us having to worry about begging every student that walks through the door to come into our programs.
Right. So for outreach efforts, I would love to get insight into how you feel that focusing on the end point, right? Talking with the employers and doing the business development piece to identify students marries the providing the value to students and letting them figure out their path forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot more market research, I guess, in our work for grad than in undergrad. And, you know, our work is not so, as I mentioned before, undergrad admissions can tend to be a little bit more siloed. Like my job in undergrad is to recruit students from New York State to come to Roger Williams. Okay. So whereas with grad, I'm doing program development with faculty, you know, those faculty relationships, anybody who's working on grad understands that that's a little different from undergrad. We really have to be tight with the faculty and tight with the deans, whereas the undergrad folks can largely stay out of that academic world and let their bosses worry about that. But with the grad side, we have to really be tight with them because the nature of the programs and what people want and the academic needs and all that, we have to be front and center with them on planning and making changes to programs. We have to be the eyes and ears on the road. You know, when folks are asking for certain programs, you know, we get asked about public health 1,000 times before COVID ever hit, right? And we were like, oh, I wish we had public health because that's what everybody wants. And then we have this major pandemic. It's like, oh, we could have, you know, so there's a lot of writing that we had down, but just, you know, didn't get anywhere. But we have to be the eyes and ears. And so sometimes it's with employers. And I think that's, some employers are more open than others to having conversations that things can be customized. Some employers tend to be hesitant to kind of, wed one school. So they might be more inclined to give their employees options because they don't want to give preferential treatment to certain things. So there's some of that. In the past, you know, obviously pre-COVID, some of the corporate recruitment stuff that I saw successful was when schools would group together. So if I were to call my colleagues at Bryant and University of Rhode Island and Providence College and UMass Dartmouth, folks that are in our region, to then say, okay, I'm going to go call up Fidelity and show up with 8 schools to talk about our programs. They're a little bit more open to that kind of an approach. I think a lot of grad programs have advisory boards, and that's something that a lot of the faculty kind of and deans set up on their own, independent of submissions people. I don't necessarily love that it's totally independent of us because we really need to be integral to that conversation. So to the extent that your audience has an opportunity to be part of that conversation, I encourage them to do so. But we also have to leverage other tools. Those employer relationships are in some ways old-fashioned. I don't mean that in a negative way, but that was the way we always did it, where we go to a company and say, let's set this up. Whereas now there's so many resources and so many programs and so many schools, to your point, competing with either the online space or the financials and offering discounts and yada, yada, yada. And don't even get me started on the military population, because there's a lot of schools that kind of prey on the military and veterans, especially those coming back, and they have all these GI benefits, and schools are just hungry for these students. But
empty promises there, yeah.
There's a lot of promises that are made that just, it's and there's schools that are for profit and some that aren't accredited, and so there's all these just messy things. But with the market research for grad goes far beyond, you know, the employer stuff, and there's a lot of digital resources now. Platforms like Burning Glass, and a company that has EMSI is another one. They do a lot of enrollment insights, and these types of platforms you can get on your own. You don't have to hire somebody to do it for you, which I think is really one of the benefits of some of these platforms. But those platforms that I mentioned, they look at job descriptions and what's out there. They do kind of a nightly scrub of job postings around, and they really look at the types of skills that are being asked for, what types of degrees. They have some enrollment insights on which schools are conferring specific degree areas, you know, different programs, how many people have been conferred the last several years. So really looking at the broad market demand and where you can kind of identify where there's gluts. So cybersecurity is an easy one. There's actually a great, there's a partnership with Burning Glass and a series of others I just discovered recently, where they have a site that's dedicated to all of the data supporting how there's huge gaps in hiring for cybersecurity analysts. There's such a demand. There's hundreds of thousands of jobs that are vacant right now in cybersecurity, and there's all these schools offering them. But then it's kind of like, well, why is this happening?
Where'd they go?
They're not going anywhere. There's certainly more demand for them. So you can actually look at a site like that. And I think that I'll try to think of it at some point we could share with your viewers. But a site like that actually shows a map of the entire US, and you can see by color code where there's the greatest gaps for cybersecurity. So then you can say, okay, well, if I'm a cybersecurity program and I'm located in Massachusetts, where there's currently a big gap in jobs, how can our program meet those demands? How can we respond to that? And you can also start looking at the marketplace, see how many schools are offering a program like that are going to meet those demands. And sometimes then you can take those insights and say, okay, Fidelity, okay, CVS Corp, these are huge demands that you have as businesses that are fighting hackers and things. How can we respond to that? And I see there's a huge gap in the hiring in this area. So there's a lot of different tools that way. And you can also look at things as simple as Google Trends, which is free. People can go right on the web and look at what keywords are performing for certain programs and what people are searching for geographically, where they're important. And you can start getting little insights. So it doesn't necessarily require spending tens of thousands of dollars on a platform or hiring a consultant or a marketing firm to do something. And there's also a lot of marketing firms out there that do just canned stuff. So you have to be careful. I mean, there's a lot of good marketing research out there that you can do on your own, just with insights on Google and keyword research and so on. That doesn't necessarily require hiring all that stuff, but then you have to be very specific and vet the firms appropriately on who's going to give you something of value. So there's a lot out there, but it definitely goes far beyond just kind of that employer, what are your needs? But I think a lot of schools miss that piece too. And it's harder to get into companies now to do that for some of the reasons I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. One of the things that you discussed a while back that I would love to circle back to is identifying your Samantha, as you put it, and how do institutions, our listeners, really branch out from, they know what Samantha did to get here. How do they find Stevie and Samuel? How do we begin to find ways to reach those students that we haven't yet been able to serve, that are certainly in need of our programs, but maybe for one reason or another, we haven't been able to attract them yet?
Well, there's kind of two sides to that coin. One is, what are the needs of Stevie and those others? And ultimately, if they have certain needs that you're not meeting, that's an internal conversation, right? So it might be, cybersecurity, I'll go back to that example. We have a fully online cybersecurity program, but Stevie might want a campus-based program. So how do I attract? I could say I want to attract Stevie here, but Stevie keeps coming to our website and seeing we don't have an on-ground program, so he's going somewhere else. So you have to have that piece of the self-awareness first. And those conversations aren't always pleasant. That's an easy conversation online or on campus, but sometimes the questions aren't that simple. Sometimes it's questions of quality. If you're not competing in a competitive environment with a program, maybe programs are turning out graduates to the big four accounting firms and your program isn't, or you just don't have the brand awareness. So sometimes there's bigger things that you have to do, as far as maybe it's academic quality and structural things, or it's just a matter of how do we build awareness that we're even here. One of the challenges that I had coming into Roger Williams 6 years ago was I talked to folks all over the place. I grew up in this area. I knew Roger Williams as an undergraduate place. And I was hearing the same thing from people out in the marketplace. They were saying, oh, they've got great undergraduate programs there, but I had no idea they had graduate programs. So the first few years of being here was just get our name out there that we have graduate programs. So we spent a lot of money just focused on just general graduate search campaigns, even outdoor. We did billboard stuff. We did posts at the mall. We did radio advertising, things that just kind of built the fact that we have graduate here. Forget the programs, but just the awareness of that. That's the one time I would say it makes sense to advertise your grad programs in aggregate if you need to do an awareness kind of campaign of the entire kit and caboodle, right? But then beyond that, you have to get very program specific as far as their needs and look at, and it sounds basic, but do some channel research. I mean, we know that when I came here, we were advertising on NPR, and I asked them, why are you doing that? And they said, well, that's where the working adults are. I'm like, well, is this the target audience that you want in these programs? I mean, NPR audiences tend to be a little older, maybe more executive, certainly more affluent and educated. So if you're trying to get somebody who's on the cusp of trying to get to middle management, maybe is in an early career thing, maybe they're listening to the country station or top 40. So we shifted our whole radio strategy to pop stations, pop format stations. And you can ask, whether it be radio, TV, streaming, over the top, whatever channels you're looking for, they can give you demographics, so you have an understanding of who you're getting out there in front of. And to my point earlier, as far as, I think it was Samantha that I was talking about, that was mid-30s and working professional, single mom, whatever. We had a pop country format here, radio, that was really hitting at a female audience that was 28 to 36. Okay, well, that's my prime audience for Finding Samantha, right? So that's how we kind of built on that. And similarly, Facebook, LinkedIn, you can get a lot of the demographics. There's so much research out on just a quick Google search can give you a lot of sense of demographics of each of those platforms. And, we know the younger students now, 17, 18-year-olds that are just on the cusp of undergraduate, let alone graduate. Are they using Facebook as much? Yeah. Are they using Instagram? Yeah, to some degree, but a lot of them fake Instagrams. I've heard a lot about those. TikTok is coming, but I'm not advocating a lot of grad schools, at least right now. I'll get onto things like that. And I also encourage people not to bite off more than you can chew. I've worked with folks where they just said, well, we have to be everywhere. It's like, well, why? Most of us don't have 20 people to delegate to. So we have to think about our resources, and we have to think about how can we effectively get in front of people. We can say like, oh yeah, that's great that they're going to be listening to this radio station and they'll be on this channel. But if you just throw it out there and hope it does well, that's not a plan. You have to have a really effective plan for the types of messages, when people are hearing or seeing your messages, and who's receiving them. And is the messaging addressing the needs that they have? And, if Stevie in your example is somebody that we want, and that person wants an on-campus program, we create an on-campus cybersecurity. Okay, hey, Stevie, guess what? We have an on-campus cybersecurity program. That's the right message, right time, and getting, to the needs of that student. But the spray and pray stuff is really tough. And I always encourage folks, if you can, focus on channels that can allow you to get very specific in your targeting. Social is an easy example because you can, age, job, their favorite TV shows. If you got criminal justice, why not target folks that love CSI and Law and Order? There's other ways to slice and dice these groups rather than just their gender and their location and whether they're in a criminal justice program. So there's so many ways to do it, but that's how this gets intensive, labor intensive and complicated. But start small and kind of find the primary places where those students are going to be, and you have to make sure you allocate the right amount of money to them. I know that's always a challenging situation, but that would kind of be my kind of multi-pronged, Cliff Notes version of how you'd approach that. But you really have to be very specific about those audiences and where they are, and you can't just pray and hope that they show up.
Right, and data is your friend. Being able to have all of that tracked and reporting and segmenting out the audiences, both from the marketing side and from the enrollment side, is going to be increasingly more important for institutions. I would love to pick your brain here, either at your institution or where you have friends. Are you seeing more of a focus in staff time and resources towards the collection and the analyzation of the reporting data? Do you have a data analyst in your office?
No, we certainly don't have
next
that
budget, right?
Yeah, someday. If anybody wants to be philanthropic and they're watching Higher Ed Live, feel free to support us. We and we're not alone. We don't have a data analyst in our office. That's one of many hats that I have to wear. I think what is good about that is that we don't necessarily have to turn to hiring a data analyst as the way to solve this problem. A lot of us have access to CRMs now, thankfully, though I am always shocked at how many conferences I go to and I talk to people and they're like, oh, we're still managing that in Access or Excel. I'm like, oh God. It's just, there's so many good platforms out there right now, and every platform, whether it's something like Element 451 or you've got Technolutions, Slate, you've got Recruit, and I won't say good or bad about anything, but analytics are a core part of any good modern CRM. I'd say Element 451 wins in that battle of any of the CRMs out there right now because they built that platform with the goal of analytics being central to that work. And the more that you have, whether it's something like that or others, having a system that allows you to track from source all the way to sitting in a seat in your classroom and ultimately to alums, if you can get that far. That's the best. If you can get a soup to nuts tracking, so you can say exactly, Marie came to us and we met her on, Google as a first. She clicked on this ad with this content. She came to an open house, blah, blah, blah. She ends up in the program. She goes through, she persists in 2 years. She goes and graduates and gets a great job at Fidelity. That student journey tells us an awful lot. And people that persist, knowing that that data is really important. And I'd love to be able to just, we're starting to get this now, but be able to dial in and say, all right, these are the people who persisted in our program. How do we create a persona from that group? The people that we know are successful, not only choosing us, but successful in the program or successful as alumni. So having all those data pieces are critical, and the CRMs open up a lot of those doors, and they have, whether it's querying or report tools or whatever, or if you're using something like Tableau, there's so many great tools out there to give kind of that layperson access and the ability to interpret and see that data. And I think I guess that's where the skilling needs to kind of come in a little bit, is being able to look at data and say, what's my actionable insight from this piece of information? We can overload people with data, but what do we do with that information is really going to be important. So I hope folks engage, whether it be with Higher Ed Live or NAGAP or other sources, to really understand data and how you can be strategic with it, because there's so many data points that these systems will offer. So again, I don't think it's necessarily about hiring an FTE necessarily, but being able to have, your folks that are listening in on this saying, I need to, whether you're there or not, skill up on data analysis and understanding how I can use it strategically in my work. That's going to make you much more valuable to your employer and to other schools and so on, and really make some more strategic decisions about, personas and marketing channels and ROI. I do stuff, very basic ROI. I'll take, if I spend $20,000 in X source, and I'm able to track through, okay, 20 students came from that source that are sitting in class. And I'll say, okay, let's say on average their revenue is $20,000 per student. Okay, so I got $400,000 in revenue there. So I take that, and then source Y brings me 10 students. So that's $200,000. So I can see that I'm getting double the return on that source X. Now, I'm not saying take source Y off the table, but you can make some strategic decisions regardless of where you are in the pecking order at your campus and say, okay, look, I've got this from this source and this from that source. How can we make sure that our limited resources, which is most of us, can say, where do we allocate them more efficiently? And that allowed me to make some decisions, especially at New Haven, but also here, where we said, all right, we're spending this amount of money with X, but if we boost this 40%, let's see what that does on the other end. And it exponentially grew our enrollments on the other side. So being able to make those decisions and have access to the data. And that's the troubling thing for some entry-level folks, especially. You might be lower down and not able to access data. So always advocate for yourself to have access to data if you can, even if you can't scrub it or pull it apart in Excel or something, but at least being able to visualize and see what's out there, having those insights is so important.
Definitely helps guide the next decisions. So I know we are close to time here, but I want to get a quick tips here. So for many institutions, as we've kind of discussed in circles, the fact is that relying more heavily on graduate growth is going to be a big part of how institutions move forward. I would love to get any advice you may have for those on this that are seeing that coming and trying to find what they can quickly adapt for their staff, or be able to rethink the way they're doing things so that they can make a big splash.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, and I know some of the higher ups don't always like to hear this, but you're going to be better off if you have staff that are dedicated to supporting your graduate efforts. I've seen a lot of campuses of late, and I was particularly taken aback by an RNL study in 2019, so it was about a year and a half ago. 7 out of 10 respondents said that their undergraduate offices were responsible for graduate recruitment. That kind of makes my stomach turn a little bit. And that's not to say the undergrad folks don't know what they're doing or that they're incapable. It has nothing to do with any of that. But the reality is that the grad skill set, and hopefully you've heard that through this conversation, is far more differentiated and requires a lot of very specific kind of tactics and understanding your audiences and approaches and your relationships with faculty and so on. Those things cannot be done very easily by folks that are used to just kind of that one train for undergrad and doing the specific things that you need to do. Plus, and I've seen this on my campus, and I'm a broken record around here, unfortunately, where you have people that, mind you, our institution relies on 90% or so of our revenue to come from undergraduate numbers. And that's not atypical of a small institution like ours. when you have folks that their job is to focus on undergraduates just because of the culture of the place and the nature of the revenue and so on, to add in grad as one of their 5 spokes or 10 spokes of things that they do, inevitably it does not get the attention or the support or focus that it needs. So really having folks that their job is to make sure that your graduate marketing efforts are on par, or that you're supporting the graduate students the way you need to do. I always think that folks are better off doing that. The other thing that I would mention is that we're in a market now, and if you think about the societal pressures and political pressures and so on, when you think about diversity and equity and inclusion, I didn't want our conversation to go without us at least talking about it briefly, but we have so much work to do as far as access and supporting students of color and students of any sort of difference, physical or otherwise, that there's so many ways that we can market differently to these groups, so way that we can make so many ways to make education and our messaging accessible. You know, we had a conversation on a conference back in February. Something as simple as alt tags on photos on your website. When you think about folks that have you know, that have vision issues or need to be able to see what's on your website and you don't have alt text, I mean, something as simple as that from an accessibility standpoint goes such a long way. But thinking about inclusive messages, inclusive photography, but not your staged, you know, 4 students, you know, my one Asian, black, white, and, you know, Hispanic student sitting under a tree. We don't want that stuff. You need to be honest with who you are. And that's particularly true with the graduate population. Be authentic with what it is that you can deliver, what you offer, what your populations are like, what your experience is like. Don't overpromise. I mean, that's true of undergrad, but to some degree, undergrad, you can get away with it because you have other experience things that kind of fill in the blanks. Whereas graduate students are so focused on getting certain experiences, certain research, certain internships, you know, being with students like themselves and in a population that's supportive and faculty that are supportive. That's very critical to their entire experience. And any of us who are marketers know that their word of mouth is going to make or break our programs. So if somebody has a bad experience or feels like they were slighted or there was some sort of disadvantage or somebody said something inappropriate to them, it doesn't take long where that filtrates to their family, friends, coworkers, and so on. And that can really be a killer for your programs. But beyond all of that, it's the right thing to do. We need to support students with differences. And one thing that we've learned through COVID, and I'm glad we've learned it. It's unfortunate we've learned it a little late, but particularly first generation students, students that otherwise might not financially have the support that they need or not have the advising support that they need to even know what to ask or where to ask or to go visit campuses. You know, for them, access has always been a huge barrier. Now that we've had a lot of virtual fairs through COVID, it's been amazing how many students that we've met that we otherwise never would have. They weren't coming to grad fairs because they didn't know that was the thing they should do. They weren't getting support on their campuses. They weren't traveling to our campuses. So having that kind of access lens, it's opened up a whole new way to connect with students who otherwise couldn't connect with us. And it's allowed us to attract students here that are really great fit, that otherwise had no idea who we were, and really needed good support and needed to be in an environment like ours. You know, in our case, you know, we're small, personalized, we try to be very inclusive, but we're also a very homogenous white campus. So that's something that is a challenge for us. But working on supporting students with a variety of differences, but in a place where we can focus on them here. They're not a number, they're a name and a face. And there's a lot of students, particularly first gen, that benefit from an environment like that. So we're fortunate for that. So anyhow, long story, but really kind of getting out there in front of all the students who might need you and giving them the education and support that they need. And I would say that's the one other thing I would suggest to you all. We haven't talked about content here, and I'll try to spare a long discussion of it, but there's all of the paid marketing that we can do. There's SEO on our website. There's certainly the content on our website, but thinking more broadly, how can we deliver things of value to our audiences? Something as simple as, how do you apply to graduate school? How do you get financial aid for graduate school? How do you select a program in public health? Creating that content, make it a downloadable guide, and then that way, you know, somebody will give you, in inbound circumstance, give you their name and email, and then you can talk to them more. But giving something value there is important, but really educating our audiences. There was a book called Different by, I think Youngmi Moon is the name of the author. She's from Harvard. And one of the quotes, and I'm not going to do it justice, but she talks about how her and her husband walk into a shoe store. So if you go into like Foot Locker or something, and you see hundreds of shoes on the wall, right? So somebody who doesn't know anything about shoes is going to look at this like, where on earth do I start? Whereas somebody who knows shoes and Nike and all that stuff, they might look at the wall and say, that's the exact thing that I want. Our students are similar, especially first-gen students or students who haven't had advising. And if you're talking about graduate school, you need students to get into the right program. They don't want to spend 2-3 years on the wrong program. They don't want to spend all sorts of money, go on to all sorts of debt for the wrong program, and they don't get the outcome that they want. So they have to find the right program. And if we don't educate them on that, and that might mean educating them without any benefit to us, no benefit to Roger Williams or anywhere else, but that the student gets the information they need about selecting the right program, that has to be our #1 priority for grad students. And then the rest kind of fits in around that. But we have to do our job of educating people on how to do the right due diligence and research to get them in the right program and ultimately get the right outcomes. I love when a student calls me and said, I didn't select Roger Williams, but I selected this program because of your advice, and I'm in the best job that I could have prepared for. That makes me feel good to know that we did the right thing in supporting that student's needs and not forcing them into a square peg round hole at Roger Williams, but instead giving them the right fit. So thinking about graduate students more holistically is critical to everything that we do.
Excellent. Yes, having that culture of giving back to students, even if it's not with a currently upcoming enrollment, it makes waves very quickly within the space, whether it's a coworker, a friend, or maybe their second degree later. So, well, I appreciate your time. I hope our listeners were able to get some really valuable content out of this. We will continue the conversation over in our social media and following the hashtag HigherEdLive. Again, I'm Marie Elliott with Platform Q Education. And we had Marcus Hanscom on with us today to discuss graduate marketing and how we can make a better impact moving forward after COVID. Thank you all.